Yeah,
Yes,
normally it's a little
better
red.
to
Ah, that's it. Yeah, I see it.
better to cut it later, yeah. Okay, okay, my son is busy writing his bio something exam. Biomolecular cell, very molecular biology, 48-hour format, grilling, so he won't be sleeping for the next 2 nights. Yesterday finished another one. So windows closed, telephones shut, getting ready. Okay, here.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, Wayne.
Hello. How are you, Wayne?
Hello, hello. We need to type a message for if anybody have any questions or any requests for anything whatsoever, then please send them. Global initiatives. Let's see if I spelled that correctly. Yes, everyone, for any questions. Any questions at info@globalinitiatives.co.uk, and then they will be transferred to Bill or to Paul or to the website, which is going to be built. It's actually in a process right now.
Those questions will be after the event. There will be questions during the event as well.
Yes, yes. Yeah, question and answer after, yes. But this is just for, you know, to email. If there is something to email, that's the address to email to. So that's what we have. So we are at 1/3 of the signed participants. About, yeah, getting there. Slowly but surely.
So how does it feel being an OBE, Bill?
Me?
Yeah.
I shook hands with the Queen, but not recently. she's self-isolating, so that was 2 years ago, and I was very lucky to get it in Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, rather than going down to London. So that was really nice, much nicer surroundings in Edinburgh than it was in London. And the Queen was there when I was there, and I said, "What's your password?" And she said, "Queen 123." So there you go. So now you know.
That's amazing.
Corgis. Corgi 123.
Was it all pomp and circumstance at the event?
Yeah, they had an orchestra, very nice in Holyrood Palace, much smaller than Buckingham Palace, and they had they played pop songs, they played Hey Jude and things like that, in a orchestra with cellos and things like that. So it was yeah, it was very nice, very nice day. It was a beautiful sunny day. There was not a cloud in the sky, which is quite unusual for Edinburgh. And it was just a wonderful occasion. And obviously the security wasn't quite as what it would be now. And yeah, it was just a nice day.
Wow. So what's the next level up then after OBE?
My Cisco CCNA, so that's the next one up. Yeah, maybe a knighthood one day. If we have a 4th spin out, we create the next Sky Scanner or something like that, then maybe I'd have a chance, but I don't think so.
We've got Ralph saying withdrawal from Open Skies. Trump to withdraw from Open Skies Treaty.
Who says? Where?
In the chat.
Oh, in the chat, yeah? Well, Oh, well.
I think we're all just admitting what we all do.
Yeah. All right.
All right, so I suggest we just get cracking. It's already 5 past. We've got just about half the participants here. I'll be letting everybody in as they're coming in, but we can get on with the introduction right now.
Okay, yeah, because I'm seeing some people registering in the last minute as well. Right here. So, all right. Okay, everyone. So looks like it is up to me to welcome all our distinguished guests tonight. My name is Margaret Guskov-Walsh, and I am a director of Global Initiative and Solutions, and one of the founders of the Scottish Space Power Institute. And it is my greatest honor to welcome you to our inaugural event. Our evening lecture will consist of 2 parts, cyber and space, given by Professor Bill Buchanan, and then followed by Scottish Space Power Institute, presented by Paul Szymanski. And it is Paul's vision of the space think tank that gave me an idea for an interdisciplinary institute. Then I shared this idea with Professor Bill Buchanan and Matt Houghton. And basically, this is how the initiative was born. It's been hatched, I should say, on the platform of Global Initiatives and Solutions, and we are about ready to let it go now on its own. Let me introduce to people who don't know who our stars of tonight, our key speakers are. Let me introduce to you Paul Szymanski. He's an internationally acclaimed expert on space strategies and space warfare. Paul is now in the capacity of an independent consultant. He is a major contributor to United States military space doctrine. Over 40 years of experience in all fields related to space control, including policy, strategy, simulation, surveillance, survivability, threat assessment, long-range strategic planning, command and control. In the past, Paul worked directly with the US Air Force, US Army, US Navy and Marines, as well as civilian agencies, NASA, DARPA, TIMA. His contributions range from working at the Pentagon for the Secretary of the Air Force to systems development at the Space and Missile Systems Center in Los Angeles, technology development at the Air Force Research Lab in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and into operational field testing at the China Lake Naval Test Center in California. In addition to that, Paul supported NATO Supreme Allied Commander Transformation Group. He worked in deeply covered space weapons program called non-NRO for 27 years, developing new concepts, analyzes simulations while managing technical programs critical to national US security. Paul administered and participated in multiple architecture studies, providing long-term strategic planning roadmaps to the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Congress, and the National Security Council. His vast experience gives him unique perspective of understanding all the divergent issues associated with each step of procurement processes. Paul also is a founder of the Space Strategic Center. His works have been featured in the Strategic Studies Quarterly of the Air University of the US Air Force. He is also a frequent speaker at international conferences and exhibitions on satellite and space missions throughout the world. He also developed and managed a private space strategy-related discussion group of specially hand-picked members, and many of whom are with us tonight. Recently, Paul has been approached by a major book publisher to write a book introducing the new and emerging challenges to the field of security studies, and which could serve as the foundation for modern space warfare planning and strategies. Paul lives and works out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then there is Bill Buchanan, Professor Bill Buchanan, an Edinburgh-owned professor at the School of Computing at Edinburgh Napier University. He's a fellow of the British Computer Society and a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He is also an officer of the Order of the British Empire, which he received for services to cybersecurity. And if I'm correct, he is the only recipient of that order from the area of services of cybersecurity. As I said, Bill lives and works in Edinburgh. He is a firm believer in fairness, in justice, and freedom, developed very deep love of all things related to cryptology, especially in the areas of zero-knowledge proof, homomorphic encryption, lightweight cryptology, quantum robust cryptography, and blockchain methods. He's now working on books related to blockchain, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. Bill's work includes about 30 academic books, over 300 academic papers. He's also an editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cybersecurity Technology and for cybersecurity series of books. In 2018, in partnerships with BlockPass IDN, he set up the world's first blockchain identity research laboratory. Bill currently leads the Center for Distributed Computing and Security and the Cyber Academy. His research work has led us to 3 successful spin-out companies, ZoneFox, Symphonic, and Cyan Forensics. He also developed a number of patents. He was awarded with outstanding contribution to knowledge exchange. That's the award given at the Scottish Knowledge Exchange Awards, and the Cyber Evangelist of the Year in 2016. Recently, his work on secret shares received Innovation of the Year award. Bill regularly appears on TV and radio, speaks on related to computer security issues, has given evidence to both the UK and the Scottish Parliament. He was also included in the Future Scot Top 50 Scottish Tech People who are changing the world. Bill's work has involved the transformation of our current thinking with a number of knowledge domains, including health and social care, law enforcement, and government services. He's a serial innovator, an old world breaker, a new world creator. He has a strong belief in the power of education and in supporting innovation from every angle. At the core of Bill's work is creating trusted worlds and building of new citizen-focused world. Another leg of our interdisciplinary think tank would be sitting and being supported by Matthew Hutton, who cannot be with us tonight. He's an entrepreneur, veteran, community builder, and space enthusiast, passionate about collaborative, interdisciplinary, collaborative approach in team building and problem solving, downstream space industry, fintech, health tech, and all other disciplines and solutions focused on positive global impact the innovation, opportunity, technology brings to society. Matthew currently sits on the Scottish Space Leadership Council, and with the vision to create global visibility with local impact, he's working on unifying the space industry in order to help deliver positive outcomes to mankind. Another person vital in the operation of the Institute is our gracious host, Finn Wycherley, founder and CEO of Supersize Media, which is Edinburgh-based digital agency, which creates brands, builds online and social media presence. Finn is an award-winning journalist and marketer specializing in social media communications. She has degrees in law, marketing, journalism, and human-computer interaction. And then there is me. I'm a director and founder of Global Initiatives and Solutions, which is an Edinburgh-based, Scottish-registered, uniquely designed, broad interdisciplinary platform, working as a hybrid, linking business consultancy and multidisciplinary think tank. we develop initiatives, and then we create solutions. I am an interdisciplinary professional, educated in political science, economics, law. I want to call myself an expert in national security issues, geopolitical and economic risk management, business security. Also, I am really passionate about interdisciplinary analysis and rapid decision-making process that is necessary in situations of critical management and response. So there is our team. Although we are the Scottish Space Power Institute, our outlook is very much global and reaching far beyond the interconnected issues of cybersecurity and space activities. Our objective is to engage in inclusive international dialogue and work with all international organizations. It is our ambition to firmly put Scotland on the international map by becoming not only an internationally recognized center for future civilian and military space planning, but also a center of a new enlightenment. A thought, although forged once again here in Scotland, now extending its reach and expanding into the final frontier. Scottish Space Power Institute is also about commercial ventures, job creation. We welcome both domestic and international entrepreneurs, investors, industry, academia, government organizations, all to join us. We want to specialize in space warfare theory and doctrine, cybersecurity, cyber warfare and cryptology, strategies, tactics, geopolitics, strategy and risk assessment, economy, politics, that's attached to it naturally, technological research development, and all the related business ventures. We are definitely the home of technology, innovations, and startups. Through our incubators of technology advancement and innovation, we champion community engagement and education. Our incubators are designed to operate as an integral part of a bigger picture, synchronized with and driven by the needs of industry and especially by the needs of consumers. The activities which we would like to get engaged in include development of new models and simulations, development of new technologies and products. We want to cooperate in the areas of education, research development, new technologies, organize lectures and symposia, startups, SMEs, industry, all issues related with them, space and cyber warfare related war games, analysis and briefing materials, technical materials, publications, education and student participation, and also a community engagement. Scottish Space Power Institute is here to concentrate on, champion, and address complex issues by leading and encouraging people to think along holistic innovations and to focus on solving real world problems. And with that, I hand it over to Professor Bill Buchanan, who will open up an inaugural lecture and speak about cyber and space. Thank you. Welcome, Bill.
Okay, right. Thank you for attending. I know it's not easy to listen to a lecture over Zoom, so I'm really just a warm-up act for our main speaker. But I'd like to talk about some of the issues related to cybersecurity and space. And obviously, space industry has been around for decades, and often some of the methods that are used could be fairly out of date. So I'd like to outline some of the key issues involved in cybersecurity and space. And really what we need to think about is that space is a critical national infrastructure, and that if we were to have any attacks against our space infrastructure, it could actually decimate our world. And some research has happened around this. If you look at the UK on its own, a large-scale power outage in the UK would cost the UK economy 442 billion in GDP. So obviously we need to understand the risks that are involved. And it happens in the UK. This is a Canary Wharf in London. And unfortunately for the UK, many of the data centers and the main routers that connect the UK to the world actually go through Canary Wharf. So a power outage in this part of London can actually cause real devastation around the UK. Luckily, we haven't really seen a major outage, but through this pandemic, we've actually seen quite major outages in major cities. So I think that our infrastructure isn't quite as robust as we might think it actually is. And we now see attacks against nuclear power plants in the US. And it was thought that at least 12 nuclear power stations in the US were attacked by cyber criminals. And it's happened in Ukraine. So in the Ukraine, there was an attack against the power infrastructure near the Ukrainian capital. And what it was an attack against this device here. So some malware was targeted onto that device, and that device is the thing that controls the power transformer and stops it from overheating and melting itself. The malware looked to override the critical system, which meant that if there was an overload of power, then the transformer would actually melt and it would cause large-scale damage. So we're seeing much more attacks against SCADA systems, control systems, and so on. And with systems like Shodan, it is possible for anyone to find any equipment which is connected to the internet. So very little things can actually hide just by being behind a firewall. So there is an increase in this, and this shows an example of these hackers in the US who go after power substations, and they find that it isn't too difficult to be able to breach these infrastructures. So although we might be focusing on space, actually ground stations are just as much as an attack vector and can probably bring down space quicker than attack actually in space. So these hackers will use a range of tools to be able to get access to power plants and then to try and bring them down. As we find, spear phishing is the #1 attack vector on the internet just now. And as long as one person within an organization clicks on a spear phishing email and installs a backdoor Trojan, then it could be possible for them to bring down the organization. So we really need to understand that. And obviously we need to understand the concept of cyber warfare, and that warfare in the future may start through a cyber attack. It could be triggered through non-malicious reasons, and that entities could be pinpointed as being the source of an attack, but nations could battle each other through cyber warfare, hoping to critically injure the other adversary. But it could be that they could devastate the whole data infrastructure of companies. So it could be a trigger for warfare. It could decimate a country. A loss of the internet could cause healthcare systems to fail and so on. And it's happened around the world that there has been major outages in cities when the critical infrastructure is decimated. So do we have a hackable space? Well, some people think it's only a matter of time before someone hacks space. From the UK, we have David Livingstone from the Chatham House, who said that people are shuffling paper around and only a disaster might catalyze serious action. So many people are saying now that space becomes another battlefield, and it can be a massive attack surface for the nations of the world. And the reason for this is that we are highly dependent in our world upon our space infrastructure. Increasingly, cars are using GPS systems, and we're moving towards smart cars and smart trucks and so on, which are guided without humans and will be able to control the destinations of our vehicles. Flights, of course, are governed, our weather, finance, shipping. And really what we're seeing is a move from military systems towards commercial systems. We're also looking from wealthy states who were able to invest in their space infrastructure towards a more market force driven economy. And within the UK alone, the industry is worth over 300 billion across the whole world. And the UK sees this as a major growth area for innovation. Glasgow is one city in the UK which has a long track record of space innovation, and the UK is really looking to build on that and move space perhaps from defence systems towards things like healthcare, reducing poverty and so on. And when we look at space, then we really have to understand the spectrum that's involved in the radio frequencies which are used, and each one of them is hackable in some way and could possibly be jammed. So the areas we typically look in terms of space is around this region, but obviously with 5G technology and with increasing demand for bandwidth, we're looking much more at the higher frequency line of sight ranges. And obviously if we can tap into these, then we will increase the bandwidth and obviously the potential that there is. Many people see 5G as the panacea of a network connected devices with low latency and so on. But when we think of it, 90% of the world is not connected through even cellular technology. Then what are we going to do to be able to patch together an infrastructure that is always on and allows every citizen in the world to have some connectivity to the internet? So we're moving on, and obviously there are many ways that we can, that a hacker can look to be able to break our satellite system. Spoofing is obviously one, and there is nothing to stop someone from setting up their own satellite transmitter. Denial of service is one of the ones that's one of the most difficult to defend against. Obviously, spectrum methods can be used to reduce that, but one thing that an attacker would do against a defender is to swamp the battlefield with radio frequencies, which will destroy the signals and can even destroy equipment. We can also see cracking if weak encryption is used or no encryption is used. It's not too difficult for someone to be able to listen into the communications, and then even jam. And there have been signs that there can even be malware that could be installed on satellites that could cause maliciousness. And obviously the base stations themselves could be hacked. So there are many threats against our space infrastructure, and we need to make sure that the physical security is probably the strongest of all, because without physical security, then you have no security to actually build on. So you can have the best cryptography in the world. If someone destroys your power supplies, then you are really decimating your whole infrastructure. So we really need to understand the range of attacks that are possible and to be able to mitigate against them, possibly having alternative paths that we can use to switch between, because the internet was meant to be an infrastructure that had multiple paths and wasn't meant to be dependent upon one route to get there. Unfortunately, the internet we've created is not really built like that. So we need to move away from centralized systems towards distributed systems and have to have failover because now the internet is almost 100% critical for our livelihoods. And then these risks move from something that can be reversed, such as a denial of service or electronic warfare, towards something that is difficult to unreverse or make them non-reversible. A ground attack, nuclear detonation in space and so on, orbital threats and so on are actually very difficult to mitigate against if we receive physical damage in there. So we need to really understand this, and there has been examples of satellite hacks already. China has been pinpointed as one possible source. I don't know if it's been proven yet, but there are signs of probing around space systems. One framework that we use to be able to understand wireless communication security problems is what's called the MITRE framework. And this could apply very well into a space infrastructure. We see here that there are many different sectors and there are many different threats in each. And normally what we do with Wi-Fi systems is to be able to analyze our threat actors, go through each of the opportunities for our threat vector and make sure that we have some mitigation and defense against them. So we can see it's a very complex issue to be able to secure these systems. One area that we could do this is within cryptography, and we need to understand the usage of keys. This system here, has been recently published, is a role-based access control method. It means that the encryption itself cannot be accessed without the right attributes. So the right attributes is that you need to provide location information, user information, and time information. So in this case, a key might only be possible to be regenerated for 1 hour, and then the encryption is then useless. But overall, we need to understand the encryption, and we probably need to look at overlay models. And overlay models means that we might have a core encryption for the link, but we build encryption on the top of that. In fact, we don't even need tunnels. We should be encrypting data at its source. But the more we encrypt, the better it's probably going to be able to defend our systems. So this is one system that we're looking at just now. So this is a smart asthma inhaler, and it will connect through 5G across the city, and we use a blockchain infrastructure for our security. The data itself can then feed through to the NHS, and then we can create an alerting system for users from, say, in our case, the NHS. But the worry about this is that if the 5G network fails, or if we're outside a city, then how are we going to get this connection? So the project that we're planning just now includes a company called R3 IoT, which uses satellite communications for IoT. And this is useful because in Scotland we have places like the Highlands of Scotland, which have very little coverage for internet. So we can use IoT as a backhaul. This would allow us to bring healthcare, telehealth to virtually every citizen in the whole world. And if we can make it cheap enough, we can make sure that smart inhalers and so on can actually connect into a network infrastructure. Obviously, it brings in many security problems, and we're focusing on using cryptography to make sure that the citizen has control of the data connected from a smart inhaler, and we will tunnel through the whole of the network. And it's only looking at these whole holistic plans can you actually start to rebuild our healthcare system. So one area that we're seeing a growth in is obviously smart cars. And when you think of what we take for granted when we drive a car, all of the distractions that go on, all of the things that appear in front of us, most of the time we're on automatic pilot, but something new can appear. A child may run it in the middle of the road in a motorway that we've never seen before. So our brains can really cope with this, and we're continually making decisions based on risks. So a smart car must make those decisions in real time using all of its sensors, and any incorrect decisions could lead to a large-scale loss of life. So one way that we use satellite communications is to be able to send LiDAR pulses to be able to map the region from a 3D point of view. So this gives cars the opportunity to do that. So in a car system, there are various different levels of risk. So at level 1, all of the sensors are working. We're using radar, LiDAR, GPS, and so on. So all of these systems are working. We're getting X, Y coordinates. We're getting a Z altitude. Our LiDAR is working through the glass, and so on. The radar is working. But we need to understand, if something fails, then we're moving up the risk scale, and the car needs to understand that it could be struggling to make good decisions. So a car should be able to switch itself off if it's losing GPS coordinates because it's in a rain storm and it's struggling to be able to get the feedback required from them. So we have inaccuracies through the sensors and so on. So these risk levels allow us to be able to understand where we actually are. So this could be the future. Perhaps we might get in our car and we can have a snooze on the way and read the newspaper, check our email and so on, and our car will be able to drive for us. That's the perfect scenario. But there are massive amounts of processing going on. There's the usage of GPS. Any inaccuracies, even of a few feet, could cause a large-scale loss of life. And one car just has to crash into city centre, and we could lose all trust in smart cars and smart devices. This one here was taken in the UK. This is the car driving completely from GPS. So there is no radar involved at all in this car. It's not using infrared at all. This is a car driving itself using GPS system. And what we'll see is it's not quite as nice. You see, it's a very busy street with cars on either side. There could be children running out into the street and so on. And look at the steering wheel. The steering wheel is moving back and forward. So this is purely using GPS with a Google map and to be able to understand the cityscape in front of it. And you can see that if we were to lose our GPS information, or if there were to be any inaccuracies, then it may cause a great deal of problems. But when you think that the machine has to make decisions based on the location that it's receiving, we can see how important these systems actually become. And this shows some of the weaknesses that we find within Wi-Fi systems. So these two intruders here go to the door and then will create a Wi-Fi relay from the key fob to the car. So in this case, the key is stored just after the door and is obviously transmitting a signal that would normally be used to be able to open up the car. The hackers in this case take the radio waves and then will transmit it from one person to the other, and thus opening up the car. So really, Wi-Fi is a very brittle space. Satellite communications is obviously based on that. So we really need to understand some of the risks that are actually involved. Okay, so that was my little presentation, and I'm really just setting things up for the main presenter. Hopefully you'll understand some of the risks that we are and the importance of space for our future. Hopefully we can start to build systems that are much more robust and resilient. Okay, thank you, Margaret.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bill. We are having some questions posted here. We will answer that after our next lecture. So welcome, Paul, now your lecture. Now we want to learn about space and about the Institute, about your vision.
Okay, let me start the briefing. So can you guys see the briefing and hear me? No?
I presume yes, I think, but everybody are muted. So yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, like was mentioned earlier, I've been working this for, well, it's close to 46 years now with outer space and missile warfare. And so over the years, I've developed a lot of ideas about the general theory, the policy, what kind of doctrine you might want to develop, and then more specific strategies and tactics. In probably the last 20 years of my life, I've been emphasizing essentially how to fight and win the next space war. And since all this is very new, I think it takes very little to win, quite frankly, because a lot of people don't really understand it. And another interesting aspect is there's a lot of history going back thousands of years, examples that show supposedly technologically superior forces have been beaten by smaller forces simply because those smaller forces had better doctrine and strategies, or, you know, just maybe it's almost a cultural kind of thing. So I think it's very important to study this and in a theoretical sense. And that's why I'm proposing this Space Power Institute. And this would be one of maybe several across the world. This particular one would be established in Scotland that would orient itself according to European and NATO values, and would also be able to interface with other institutes developing space warfare concepts like in the United States. So as I see the purpose of the Scottish Space Power Institute, looking at the foundational outer space warfare that I had mentioned for theory, policy, doctrine, strategy, and would establish Scotland as the premier center for NATO and worldwide space military planning. And I think there is several major issues that one has to think about. And, you know, one is the basics of why space warfare. And I think one of the answers to that, and let me see if I could find my little laser thing, laser pointer, is down here. Trotsky, more than 100 years ago. He stated that you may not be interested in war, but sooner or later it's going to bite you. And there's a lot of people say, well, let's not do war in space and let's have it as a sanctuary and so forth. Well, those times are past. War has happened in space. It will continue to happen. And if you sit there with your head in the sand and say it's not going to happen, it's sooner or later going to bite you, one way or the other. So that's certainly something should be discussed. You know, why space warfare? What are the, I guess, different levels and escalation control and so forth. The other thing is, when you're talking about any sort of action, whether political, military, economic, there's always those who benefit from the action and who loses. And it's very important to kind of understand that kind of economic, political spreadsheet of that. Also, there's all this concept of balance of power in Europe versus what are the threats. And I'll go over some of the unclassified threats in a few slides. There's a perception that something has to be done. And that perception is because things have changed. There has been some major things that have inspired people suddenly to start talking about this. So how does Europe fit in? How do the individual countries fit in? What do they think their roles are? How are they going to handle the politics associated with it, and so forth? Number four, when we're talking about the Scottish Space Power Institute, possibly this can be an honest broker for the competing interests in the European space warfare. I mean, I doubt Scotland anytime soon is going to develop space weapons. Nevertheless, they can certainly think about it, talk about it, negotiate, and so forth. And so there's various competitions going on in space. You know, for example, Germany and France. Would Scotland possibly establish itself as a referee? And actually, one way you can do this is there's several companies who've already done this. They've developed a whole network of optical sensors around the world to detect what's happening in space. And each of these actually don't cost that much. There's amateur astronomers who have remotely controlled telescopes that they rent out to other astronomers every night. And so for not much funding, you can establish a network to just observe what's happening in space. And I believe the most important thing for space is situational awareness, whether you call it space situational awareness, space domain awareness, and it's just understanding what is happening, because the distances involved in space are so vast, and it's so easy to hide things in space, surprisingly, that you can get away with all kinds of stuff. And I believe we have, let's say we as the world and different nations have done all kinds of funny things in space. I've been able to detect it myself with some of my space status software. And you can understand better what might be happening. And this is kind of important, because if you think any smart adversary in a modern world would think, well, before I start some serious conflict on the ground, I better take out my potential adversary's eyes and ears in space beforehand. And in order to do that, you need to set up these attacks. It's very difficult to actually do. The orbits aren't continuous in the sense that there's only certain parts of the orbits that, let's say, you're going to start maneuvering at to attack another satellite. And these are kind of well known. You could easily use the orbital dynamic equations and you figure out. And probably you can establish different choke points in space and say, well, if I see an adversary starting to concentrate potential anti-satellites in these choke points, that might imply that he's really setting up ultimately to do some major military actions on the Earth. And if you can establish that, you might be able to confront the adversary and what he's doing in space and maybe prevent what's happening on the ground. So maybe Scotland can do that. Anyone can do that. So the other thing is this Scottish Space Power Institute could be an interface to other allied interests, in particular in the United States. Develop a whole concept of space warfare, all the principles and so forth, hold joint conferences, interface with other countries, think tanks in this area, and if nothing else, establish a dialogue. Because this is so new, you really need alternative ideas, alternative cultures, military traditions, and so forth to come up with probably the most optimal plans that you can. And I've already mentioned the terrestrial conflict links. And ultimately, you might be talking about worldwide political recognition for Scotland as an honest broker and a negotiator when it comes to things happening in space. And this is just a notional chart of all the possible funny things that could happen in space. There's, of course, a lot of natural events with solar flares, micrometeorites, and so forth that can mess with your satellites. And the trouble is because you can't really directly image a satellite from the ground, it's very difficult to determine what has happened. And it might be that it was a natural failure, you know, part just broke, or maybe the solar flares or something that happened. And I have a book on satellite failures, and it's really interesting to read this because engineers believe in perfection. And so they design these satellites and don't design them for imperfections. So there's things like, gee, I didn't know that the Earth limb sensor would maybe see the moon and make the satellites, you know, spin out, or this or that. There's all these kind of excuses. But ultimately, it always took them months to try to figure out what happened. And even then, it's just an estimate. Now, my simulations, I mean, I took 100 random objects in space and said, go match the orbits of another 100 random objects. In other words, attack them. And 96% of those objects match the orbit within 24 hours. So I'm saying in 24 to 48 hours, the war is over with in space if there's a major conflict. And a lot of people are going to be sitting around scratching their heads saying, gee, I wonder, you know, that satellite stopped working. You know, I'm not sure what happened. And what I have heard from national command authorities in Washington is that they're not going to authorize any counterattacks until they know who did it. So how do you verify and validate who exactly messed with your satellite? And you might sit there and say, oh, we happen to be in war in the Western Pacific with Taiwan, you know, over Taiwan with China. Maybe China did it, but maybe it's Russia stirring the pot and messing with it. You know, you really don't know. And so you sometimes wonder about maybe you'll self-deter and really not understand what's happening. And maybe that's a reason for having these constellations of thousands of satellites, because it would be so difficult to take them all out at once, unless maybe via cyber means. So you got the various things. You've got weather that might mess with you. Well, these are the different kinds of satellites, but certainly a nuclear burst with the increasing the radiation would mess with the satellites, which happened with the Starfire experiment in the 60s. There's various ways of jamming. Anyone can do that. I haven't looked recently, but I know years ago there was gpsjammers.com, a website where you can go order your own GPS jammers. And the Russians were very willing to sell satellite jammers to other countries. That's something within the technological capability of just about any country. And if you add into that a more sophisticated cyber attack via that, you've got capabilities across the world that you might not even know about. And then there's various laser attacks, ground-based, space-to-space based. You can take out the launch sites. There's what was mentioned earlier, physical attack against ground control facilities. There's all kinds of issues, and you really have many options. One is attack the satellite, attack the link going to the ground, attack the ground station, or attack the information coming out of the ground station and deny its ability for it to be transmitted to the commander, ultimately. And just looking out what are some of the unclassified anti-satellite threats. Certainly Russia has several more traditional, like the direct-to-sun ASAT from the 80s, but there's a talk of a ground-based laser, or there's been various testing going on. You get a copy of this briefing, you can all go to click on these links and see the discussions of that. Now this concept of satellite inspectors, I think that's the in thing lately. Satellites going around looking close at other satellites, seeing if they've got war reserve modes, secret doors, extra boxes on them, and so forth. Maybe you might want to do a little probing electronically. Maybe you've got a maintenance satellite that has arms on it that's made to remove different modules of the satellite and replace broken electronics. You certainly can use an arm like that to do all kinds of mischief. I mean, to my mind, these inspector satellites, maintenance satellites, refueling satellites, whatever you want to call them, it's almost the equivalent of taking a satellite and wheeling it into your garage and going at it with a hacksaw and a drill and a hammer and cut wires and do just about anything you want. And then, of course, China has demonstrated different anti-satellites. Recently, even India. Israel's talked about it. France has talked about this laser ASAT. I think that's talk. I don't know. You know, that's a little bit hard to believe at the moment, but maybe. And certainly Iran would love to. And I'm sure they probably already have jammers and maybe cyber, but they're certainly trying very hard to put satellites in space and to be able to do something beyond that. Okay, I want to list some of the proposed study topics for this Space Power Institute. And one is, what to my mind is the most important one, what are the goals for fighting a war in space? And Joint Publication 5 in the United States, I think, has a certain geniusity on this. They say before you do any kind of course of action planning and war planning and all, you sit down and write down what are the surrender criteria? You know, what are ultimately your goals? And then you work from there and see what you can do. Now that's kind of easy to determine surrender criteria for, let's say, terrestrial wars like, well, regain territory, destroy weapons, change political leadership and so forth. But in space, there's not exactly territory and so forth. So that's a hard thing to do, though I've come up with some lists for that. And then what I mentioned earlier, this critical choke points that maybe you even want to defend certain choke points. Now, certainly an obvious one is geosynchronous orbits, depending on the theater of operations. If you've got the Western Pacific scenario, then you're looking at geostationary positions over the Pacific, or maybe over the Atlantic for another scenario. And so you've got to worry about that. But there's also choke points for LEO, low Earth orbit, and medium Earth orbit, even though in reality they're moving. In another mathematical sense, they're fixed, that you need to observe and understand. And these choke points are probably different according to what are the various scenarios, the areas of operations, the AORs, what are the goals, perceived goals of an adversary? I mean, is he going to take out your imagery? Does he want to take out your navigation or your weather? Does he want to deny communications of forces? I mean, there's various goals and missions that an adversary might want to take during different phases of the conflict. And I already mentioned this earlier. And then this concept of deterrence, you know, very big thing for the discussion among people nowadays. And can you really deter someone from doing something in space in a bad way? And I think people talk about all these arms control treaties and for space. I think none of them are verifiable because, well, going back to that maintenance satellite, it's just a maintenance satellite fixing things. You know, it's not a weapon, but suddenly it can be. And it's so easy to hide things in space and so easy to hide things inside satellites. You're not really sure what is an anti-satellite or not. The other thing was the concept of conflict escalation. And that is, are there certain things that you should do and not do, be allowed to do, based on what's the conflict level on the ground? You know, are we just low-level warfare, or is it general warfare? Is it just we're kind of plinking at people, maybe politically and all that? So what are you allowed to do in space? Are you allowed to use that inspector satellite and just sort of look around? Do you go within a few kilometers or a few hundred feet? Is that threatening? Do you don't go anywhere near launch detection satellites because that looks like you're setting up for a nuclear attack. There's various maybe tripwires of things you can and cannot do in space. One of them is the cyber. Cyber is almost acceptable on terrestrial means that even in non-conflict situations, and maybe that's the same for space. But debris generation, something you're going to do, people are going to get pretty upset about that. And the various things in between that. So that's an interesting thing to talk about and understand what those tripwires are. There's a concept in the United States of flexible deterrent options. And that is, well, instead of getting mad and blowing up a satellite, you blow up a port on the ground instead. Or you do economic sanctions or diplomatic actions. And there's various other things that you can do. And vice versa, if you're pretty upset one country's doing something, you might actually mess with one of their satellites in a secretive way because you're sending a message. You're showing resolve and determination that we're ready to go to the next level if you don't stop whatever you're doing. And you can get away with that because the populace on the ground isn't going to understand what you're trying to do there. They won't be able to know about it. And I think this has actually happened. I estimate there's been 5 or 6 space wars since the 1970s. And there's been a lot happening. It's almost like in the Cold War where we would have reconnaissance with jets, airplanes probing the Soviet Union, see how far they can get in. The Russians cutting off our destroyers and sometimes accidentally ramming them, like kind of pushing the envelope. And I bet you the same thing's happening in space. Kind of, probing, pushing, seeing where the weaknesses are, understanding reactions and so forth. And then there's the classic courses of action that you see, been developed for the multiple wars. I already mentioned centers of gravity. Well, choke points, centers of gravity is different in that is there a key point or knowledge or person that if you denied, that would make a major change in a conflict. So a center of gravity might be a launch center because that takes a long time to rebuild those things. So you got to watch out for all the very poisonous materials there if you're bombing it. If you've got these, these inspector, maintenance, refueling satellites, well, they're not smart enough to do it on their own. They have to be teleoperated, much like drone operators operating drones in over Afghanistan or Iraq. So in order to do that, if the things, the inspector satellites on the other side of the earth, it needs a relay satellites. So maybe the relay satellites are a center of gravity. A center of gravity might be their doctrine. Maybe it's inadequate doctrine about space or some sort of training. It could be a lot of different things. Additional study topics. This first one I've been working with for several years, and that is taking classical warfare doctrine and trying to extend it to the space environment. So when you really get down to it, when you're talking about war, it's a competition between human minds. It really is a competition between the two adversary minds, and they're dealing with their experience and knowledge, the fears, anger, the culture, their education, and the way they communicate, the two adversary commanders, is through weapon systems. So ultimately, there's not robots fighting in space, it's humans. And so you have to really understand what are the principles for fighting wars in space. And we can learn a lot from the past. I mean, I did a study years ago, Sun Tzu's Principles of War, his Art of War, and how you can apply that to space. And even though I got through just a third of Sun Tzu's principles, I came up with 550 different strategies that one can take toward space warfare. And I think because space warfare is so new, you just have to use one or two of those and you probably win, because everyone's a neophyte in the whole thing. And then what are operational risks for space warfare? Well, you use up a lot of fuel, maybe going around doing the inspections or the anti-satellites. You're maybe creating debris. There's things like you have to do deconfliction in terms of, well, we want to take out this satellite, but somebody else is monitoring the message traffic on the satellite and you're going to mess with that. So there's all this, you know, you got to understand the bigger picture. The other thing is, what are the top principles or rules for conducting space warfare? And there's principles of war. Something I did in the 80s when the United States was trying to figure out, do we want to have a space command or a continental defense command? So I took the classic rules, principles of war, the three services in the United States, the British and Russian principles of war, and translated that to space to see how they apply. And it worked pretty good, I think. And then this space thing is, the next point is political acceptability. And I think people are kind of used to war on the ground, unfortunately kind of used to killing people on the ground. But when it comes to space, it's a big political, emotional issue for a lot of people. And so, you know, what are the legal rules and treaties and acceptability and things like that? And I think there's going to be some fallout post-conflict. And before you even try to implement anti-satellites, you have to think of the post-conflict implications. I mean, maybe some of our allies will be less of an allies if we did a lot of debris generation. And I hear in Europe, they have different rules of engagement. One particular one was they don't like the idea of taking human life to preserve equipment. And the example here would be, well, there's this ground control station that's controlling this anti-satellite that's coming to attack one of our critical military satellites. The United States wouldn't mind bombing that facility to take it out because it's wartime and so forth, where I think the Europeans might not like that idea, that you're taking this manned station and taking away life just to preserve this satellite system, even though it's maybe $1 billion satellite. So that gets into more specifically, what are the rules of engagement and weapons release authorities? Are you going to allow some operator, you know, in some darkened command center at 3 a.m. Looking and say, oh my gosh, it looks like we're under attack. I'm going to push this button and counterattack. Or do you have to go wake up the president to say, are we allowed to do this, sir? And by then, is it too late? And then there's classic things that the think tank can analyze, and that is, well, is it better to be offensive or defensive? Well, you know, a lot of people say, well, we'll defend these satellites. And I'm not sure how you do that when you're talking about hypervelocities between satellites that you could really defend or something. But it'd be nice to try to do some calculations on that and simulations and war gaming and see, you know, is it better to have 1,000 satellites that are cheap and you know, we're not particularly defending them, but it's going to take 1,000 ASATs to take them all out, or what? Or is the offense always best? Oh, well, we're going to go after the adversary ASATs first before he even gets to use them. Of course, that creates strategic imbalance. It's almost like nuclear war, you know, who pushes the button first? And then again, you know, we're talking about do the future wars favor the attacker or the defender? When you can use an inexpensive anti-satellite to take out $1 billion satellite, that's an imbalance there. So is it true whoever attacks first wins? I don't know. It'd be something for the Institute to kind of study. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what are the long-term effects on world relations for both the current arms race in space, when that's happening, and post-conflict? And then, you know, this concept of international agreements. Could there be an agreement that, well, you can't approach more than a kilometer to a satellite, or I have a right to shoot you down, or something like that? And then if you look at the different phenomenologies of potential anti-satellites, you know, directed energy, impact weapons, jammers, there's a lot of things you can do. Grapplers, you can pull it into a useless orbit, or you can make it start spinning. You could paint the solar panels or the sensors with something that just goes away in a few weeks. I've seen an analysis of if you just paint the edge, you know, a couple square feet of a geosynchronous satellite solar panel, the differential solar pressure would make the satellite slowly start spinning out. You know, there's a lot of little things that one can play with. And then this concept, well, is it better to attack the satellite, the ground systems, communication, tracking, telemetry, control, you know, and of course this would be dependent on the conflict level. And then the concept of, well, should we just try to defend satellites in orbit, or have rapid replacements or on-orbit spares, versus, oh, well, we lost a satellite, let's just build a few more drones and so forth to replace that mission. And then finally, looking at legal frameworks for space. What are the implications between space and cyber warfare? You know, what's the combination between those two? To what degree should you use each? And then our planning, how can you share that with allies? And, you know, we talk about the United States, allies, NATO, but there's also, we got Australia and Japan and so forth, and Europe. I'm sure there's a different mixture. A lot of this stuff is highly classified. How you share that, I'm not sure how that's going to work. There's other issues too, funny issues, is that the drones used in Afghanistan and Iraq are controlled outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, at Air Force Base there. And they use satellites to control those. So the satellite systems become part of the kill chain. I mean, they're going around blowing things up. Does that make the civilian satellite operators legitimate targets, like Intelsat and so forth? You know, because they're part of the kill chain. There's this whole concept now of translunar space. Is that a threat? It actually takes more delta V fuel to get to geosynchronous orbit than to get to the moon. So you could hide a lot of assets high up, way beyond geosynchronous. It takes much less delta V to come screaming back down into, let's say, geosynchronous orbit from a translunar orbit. They're at the top of the geopotential well, so you just tip it over and it comes back down in. And that's a lot of space that you can hide a lot of things in. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the realignments of allied nations and so forth due to space kinds of things. Now, here's some example products I would think a Space Power Institute would develop. There'd be models and simulations looking at these doctrinal concepts. You'd sponsor lectures, symposium, so forth. You fund some research for other entities, commercial entities and so forth to do additional studies. You might even have prizes for best research papers and so forth. There's all kinds of war games that are going around in Europe and in the United States. You show up with your ideas and doctrine and see what happens. Certainly, there's a lot of space courses that have been going on for years, and there's new ones coming up. So that's really where the most important thing is getting the doctrine down right to be able to win these wars. And then there's all kinds of space journals that you can publish in, fund space chairs at military schools, even sponsor student participation in symposia and so forth. Additional products, all kinds of analyses and briefing material to influence policy in Europe, particularly industrial and procurement policies, redoing doctrine documents, getting inputs into those. And then, at least in the United States, there's a long history of these think tanks. I'm not too familiar with the European equivalents, but you have the Project Air Force, which came out of the RAND Corporation, supporting the Air Force individually, and then the Royal Center supporting the Army. Not sure of the Navy, but certainly I think the Space Force needs something like that. And then I think really you need to have all these players coming together and trying to understand the different perspectives, and I think that will make us stronger ultimately in the end. So my final chart, the organization, I think really you start small. It could be just somebody, an admin, a core group of analysts, a modeling and simulation staff, maybe some university would donate a few offices and admin. We'd bring in prominent space and military experts, temporarily engage as consultants, do different studies, and then there'd be a general officer study steering group that you would present those studies to. Then maybe they would meet every quarter only. And then I mentioned too that I don't think you should stack it with 100% space experts. You really want those other perspectives of people who are familiar with fighting wars on the ground and bring in those different perspectives and different cultures and different attitudes and so forth. And that's essentially my briefing. We've got 10 minutes for questions.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. Questions. There are questions already posted on the chat. Everyone can see those, and also whoever wants to ask a question, please wave your hand. There is something there at reactions, and you can wave hands. You can.
Yeah, it's probably best if you just speak. It'd be hard for me to go through 21 questions here while sitting silently.
Yes. Well, on the housekeeping, yes, the presentations are going to be shared, so we will email the presentations to participants, of course. Now, all the information, all the questions that are not going to be answered now, or someone cannot think of one, but one will come later, please direct them to info@globalinitiatives.co.uk, and we will be able to redirect those. As I said right now, the Space Power Institute is sitting within the Global Initiatives and Solutions platform. Everything will be transferred eventually to the designated pages and designated website. Questions. What questions do we have here? So the recording, I answered that. Slides available. Question, I believe, to Bill. How do you delineate and define the differences between cyber attacks and electronic warfare needed for doctrine and mission allocation amongst the various organizations?
I don't differentiate them at all, really. Just like Wi-Fi, we need to understand all the weaknesses of Wi-Fi, of RF, I would define that as a physical layer. If you can think of all the different layers of the OSI model, we go right from that physical infrastructure towards the communications layer, and then if we're overlaying IP and TCP on top of that, we have all the threats that that happen around that. So I think there's almost like an infinite number of risks. You find that spear phishing, as I said, is still one of the top risks. If someone really wants to attack a satellite infrastructure and drop a Trojan onto, say someone on a base station, then even to be targeted for the people who actually work there, there's a high chance of success. So I think it's a difficult one. The Lockheed kill chain model defines that the actual infection, the dropping of a Trojan into an infrastructure can be minutes or even seconds. So if you don't detect that dropping of that backdoor Trojan onto your system, then you might be in trouble. So we see a rise in security operation centers inside banks, the public sector, and so on. And obviously in space, we have these operation centers, but obviously we'll have to move much more to 24/7 monitoring, to have security analysts working, to have threat hunters looking to the landscape, to be watching for the latest malware and threats. So I think what's happening in the finance industry, and the finance industry have done very well in understanding cyber risks. You'll find there are very little ransomware attacks inside the finance industry and banks and so on. They understand how to mitigate and to have backups. But if you look at the area that's most hit for ransomware, it's government infrastructures, councils and state control agencies who don't have a big budget. So the whole system is only as strong as the weakest link in the whole chain. And if that link breaks, then the whole infrastructure should break. So I don't really see anything. It's a one big system. The humans are as much part of that big system as anything, and they're probably more breakable than the technology.
Thank you. Dan posted a comment: it will be irresponsible for any autonomous vehicle maker to rely solely upon GPS for navigating the vehicle. If anyone is doing this, they are setting themselves up for lawsuits.
Yeah, I completely agree. I only showed the example. I don't know how that was made possible. I think it was breaching lots of laws. I could have carried on, and at the end of the road there is a cyclist, and the car cuts across the cyclist because obviously the car doesn't see the cyclist at all. So we need to be developing systems that are using satellite, but also radar, infrared, and so on. I've seen in Norway they have refuge lorries that are automated, and when you think of the damage that something like that could have in a neighborhood, then you've really got to understand the risks involved. But the GPS is one of the core things as a failback, at least to get the XY coordinates, not necessarily the Z. But if you saw the risk levels, then the most important thing was the XY coordinates from GPS. And as was said there, then if there are hacking systems that allow adversaries to move the coordinates of something, so we really need to understand all the risks involved. And I don't think we really understand those just now. You see systems where they infect in a car, there tends to be a bus. The network bus is connecting the audio system to the engine management system at all. There is no firewalling in a car at all. So if it was to be infected by malware and a backdoor, then it could actually affect the car itself.
Alex is saying, welcome to drones. That's another issue. And Tim Stevenson said the UK's SEMA doctrine for a not entirely successful attempt at marrying EW and CW. And then there is a link there for everyone who is interested to read about that. Please copy that. Next question. As the US Space Force finds its footing, should they play an instrumental role in establishing a space traffic management system, or should it be left to civilian agencies? So clearly that question is for Paul.
Well, it would appear to me it's probably not too different than air traffic management, which almost sounds like an international thing that you'd have to figure out. Certainly, that's a civilian thing, the air traffic, but then the military still understands, they have their radars, and they understand, well, this jet here looks suspicious. Maybe it's a terrorist attack or something else, and they're going to go intercept it. So it's kind of a joint thing. I'm not sure how it works with air traffic, but I'm sure there's some sort of, someone gets on the phone and calls NORAD or something like that when something is suspicious. So I think the Department of Transportation or Department of Commerce, I think they already were talking about something along those lines. I could be wrong.
Well, David made the comment that the potential for a short turnaround attack is why built-in resiliency in the system is very important.
And that, yeah, I mean, there's not much you can say. If you can really get away with that, you know, again, mentioning hypervelocities and attacks, you're not going to be able to stop that. Now, if you had another satellite, spare satellite and so forth, that'd be great. But I'm just not convinced you're really able to defend yourself. And, you know, if you've got a lot of different targets and a lot of different alternatives on the ground, that might help. But it's probably not going to help, you know, in 24 hours, 48 hours, you know, where you might be doing some operation that needs a satellite and suddenly it's not there.
What about space traffic management? Should it be a civil-led? That's kind of continual, inevitability of space warfare, rhetorics of the military that is endangering space operations. And that is a comment or question from Dines Dinsley.
So you're saying, again,
space traffic management, should it be civil lead? It's the continual inevitability of space warfare rhetoric of the military.
I think in a sense, the Air Force already has that role. They've had for the past 40, 50 years, because they have all the space surveillance assets. So they know more or less where the satellites are in the space junk and things like that. But then I thought I've been reading recently that they're trying to get rid of that role. And I'm not sure I understand what that means, because it's still going to be Air Force military radars and optical sensors and things like that. I mean, they still need that for more sensitive missions. I mean, they still have to ultimately understand, are they under attack? Versus somebody saying, oh, well, it looks like tomorrow these two satellites are going to get close. You better maneuver it out of the way.
Well, it is always when we are clashing as civilians and the civilian doctrine, civilian understanding with the military understanding, then we are coming into those situations, and the same understanding is going to be here, just on a different plane, extended basically.
Right. And I've heard some complaints about, you know, the United States has been providing this conjunction assessment as two things going to hit each other. But then they don't provide the special perturbations data, the very accurate data. They're just the general perturbations, the orbital data. And so they kind of keep that closer hold, and that's why other nations have been talking about developing their own space surveillance network. But the US is the only one that has a worldwide network. I mean, that takes a lot.
No.
I don't think the Chinese have it or anything.
Okay, so we are dealing only with one broad spectrum player basically right now.
That is cool.
Several who would like to be in that position. The race is on.
Well, yeah, it's not like the US is selling it or anything.
No, no, definitely not.
I mentioned earlier, you could set up your own optical network, but that almost assumes cooperative satellites, that are bright
Yes.
sky. And go look up on the internet stealth satellites, and you'll see a patent from the 1970s, online, barbell-shaped thing. It's easy to hide in space. I saw analyses called smart attitude. And that is, let's say you have a satellite, it's a box. And the sun hits one side of the box, the specular bounces off to the earth. Well, just change the attitude of the box so the reflection of the sun goes off into space. And suddenly you're 18th magnitude.
Yes.
A simple thing to do today, much less, well, we won't even have boxy satellites. So there's all kinds of radar absorptive material. There's NASA a few years ago invented optical absorptive materials. I'm sure there's a game that's been playing for decades.
Yes.
So if you want to hide, and there's something called uncorrelated targets, UCTs. And there's a whole bunch of them all the time that, radar picked up this target, but we can't correlate it to any known satellite. Oh, well, we'll try the best as we can. And I've heard for years, some Russian satellites, we didn't know what happened to them until they published. They were scientific satellites. We didn't know where they went, especially highly eccentric, high inclination satellites.
Oh, yeah, when you look at the vastness of space and everything else, it's kind of inevitable that you cannot find it.
Well, you could do something like purposely blow up one of your own satellites. And before you do that, secretly have another part of the satellite maneuver out, let the big satellite blow up, and then you hide in the debris cloud until it goes off and does something really mean over the South Pole. It starts maneuvering.
Yeah, perpetual game of cat and mouse, kind of. Catch me if you can.
It's going on for millions of years, let's face it.
Yes.
There's things like, I forget the satellite. The Europeans put up a gravity gradient satellite to look, because the gravity is slightly different around the Earth. And it was in such a low orbit, it had a little bit of stubby wings on it and so forth. And for it not to fall out of orbit, it was constantly thrusting for 2.5 years, electric thrusters, keeping it in orbit. Okay, put some electric thrusters on a satellite, and just before the war starts, start thrusting. And suddenly you're not following Keplerian algorithms. No one's going to find where you're at, be able to figure out where you've been and where you're going. It screws up everything. There's just a lot of little things you can do. And human beings get very clever when it comes to they're about to die, warfare. And we sit there and say, oh, well, they won't do this and they won't do that. And I've seen them. I've been to the military exercises, and they just totally blow off all kinds of obvious kind of ASATs, that could be happening.
Oh, yes. that's always happening when you go to a strategy and games, and when basically there is an interaction, and especially when there is an interaction in objects that are so vital and so delicate in terms of sensitive information, sensitive nature.
The problem is for most of my career, the space types in the Air Force had a NASA mentality. It wasn't a warfighter mentality. It was all like, oh yeah, well, we're just putting up satellites like NASA and so forth. And none of them really had the right attitude. And maybe the Space Force would change, but culture is very hard to change.
Well, yes, and especially now with the technology going forward, I think, well, as a person that is absolutely far away from technology, but very close to everything what's going on Earth in terms of strategy and everything else, and response to the threats, I see cyber threats extending to the space, and I see basically some people who would like to do us harm by hijacking some operations of the satellites, and then they can create real Armageddon here for us in economic terms, probably more than in human terms.
Yeah, no, and you're talking about people, hackers in the garage hacking. You're talking about a country doing it. They can really do a job.
Yes.
And, you know, I've seen like banks that spend $250 million a year on security, and the hackers, country hackers go right through them, no problem. And so you cannot sit there and say you're going to defend these things, because there's always a way.
There is always a way. It's a game of chess, and you got to think 20 moves ahead if you can.
Yeah, I go back to Sun Tzu and, you know, all these different
Oh,
things
yes.
from the past, because again, it's just human minds you're dealing with, not machines necessarily.
Question. Mike Stevenson says, I'm more comfortable with US Space Force as a defender and arbiter. And Alex says, why not delegate the ICAO, who have done a pretty good job of airspace? So we are having a conversation here. David says, no one would delegate military airspace control to international organization. No one will do so for space control either. And then definitely there is a question. Paul, space capabilities within NATO are owned and operated by the member nations versus NATO writ large. Also, NATO currently has only a small number of dedicated space professionals within the command structure and no military legal authorities to operate in space. Additionally, NATO has a defensive mandate without a process for deliberate planning. How does that impact the recommended study topics for the Scottish Space Power Institute?
Well, hopefully we're trying to kickstart this. I mean, they're going to lose in space if they're not really thinking about it. They don't have the organization, they don't have the training, they don't have sensors to understand what's happening. And they can't really depend on other countries to give them the real juicy stuff.
So
traffic control, we'll tell you if you accidentally something's going to hit into you, but we're not going to tell you about, oh, gee, there's this, you know, Iran has this super secret satellite that's coming at you, and you want to see what's happening, you know, and we're not going to kind of mention it.
Yes.
So, you know, this is great. You say, yeah, the NATO doesn't have these resources and facilities and personnel. Well, they better get their act together.
Wow.
That's all I have to say.
Hopefully we can help them. Hopefully
right.
the Space Power Institute can help them and can start a culture of actually acknowledging that these threats are very serious and they exist, and there is a time to actually do something about it, to act on it. And it is
what they come up with in Europe would be very important to shift over to what the United States is doing and vice versa. I mean, we just have to get these alternative ideas because it's all new, you know. Otherwise, Europe is going to again experience a blitzkrieg warfare in 1939 that totally blows them off the map, you know, if you haven't really thought this through, because the Germans had crappy military equipment. The Allies in World War II had 17 times more tanks than the Germans. Why did the Germans win? Doctrine.
Doctrine, yes, and then here now, yes, now it's
thought it through better.
Doctrine and technology. So
well, they didn't have very good technology. They had very poor tanks.
Panzer, well, now I'm saying what we have now is a technology. Civil dominance, another question. Civil dominance will unlock transparency on orbit, as ICAO has done in airspace. The military have tracked space objects for 60 years, and there is no transparency. The Scottish Space Power Institute will be better off advocating civil space leadership. No one would delegate military airspace control in UK. Civil airspace takes precedent.
So the question is,
it is more like a comment that we should be advocating here, especially in the UK, the civil space leadership.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I could see both. You got to have both.
Yeah, you got to have both.
You already have the civilian, right?
Yes, yes.
You know, the NATO equivalent. And yeah, this, you know, if you talk about space power, it also includes non-military aspects, the civilian aspects of power, the diplomatic, economic. and so forth.
Exactly,
Should
exactly.
be the other
The
half of the
analysis, yeah.
community and
Mhm.
talking together and so forth. No, it's
Yeah,
a good thing.
collaboration between the actors here. Um, they have to come, everybody have to come to a table, everybody have to come to understanding that we do have these problems and we have to start talking about these problems. And so this is what the space power, Scottish space power
Right, and
is about.
Space Force and NATO and who knows what other countries, they're marching down and doing something. Now, whether it's the right something or not, we don't know, but let's see if we can influence them to go down the right path, both for the most optimal solution and maybe the solution that affects the rest of the world the least. Because right now they're flailing about. What do they really know what they're doing? Does anyone really know what they're doing? I have a lot of ideas, but who knows if it's the right ideas, but at least it's something to start with.
All right. Okay, that's great. Who has a question? Who has a question for Mike? We are at 8:43, so let's say, I don't know, 15 more minutes.
Hey, Margaret, this is Yvette. I've had my hand up. I ask a quick question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to commend you guys. It's a great, it's just a great thought process that you guys have put together, and really appreciate the presentations that have happened here tonight. But just a quick question on time-space resources. So you guys have put forth your purpose of what you guys want to accomplish. I'm very interested in hearing the rest of the story. So is this just, one-trick pony? What's the timing of when you guys are putting this all together? I hear all these incredible thoughts and ideas. I think about, this war gaming, aspect that you guys have talked about. Then where is this physically going to be? Are we talking about making this a physical, Power Institute, or is it just virtual? And then what are your resources? How are you funding yourself to do this? Or is this just, everybody get on the bandwagon and make this happen? So it's just really about time, space, resources for the Scottish Power Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it is pretty much all of the above. We are looking for definitely right now, as I said, it is the idea that started on the Global Initiative platforms, and we are just moving it from the platform and moving it to a different spectrum, moving it to a broader audience. So we will be attracting people and individuals like yourself and like others to collaborate with us. And yes, it is going to be here in Edinburgh. At some point, we'll have a physical presence, although the organization, as Paul stated in his presentation, for a time being should be quite lean, and we have to start easy and develop slowly. Also, we want to develop it together with the hubs, with the technology, and as you know, technology is something that is very close to a government, Scottish government here, the government doctrine and so on. So we will be having this conversation as well. It was very important that we start the dialogue, that we show that there is a willingness and there is an interest in the dialogue, and we'll be taking it up from there. Any other questions?
Sky has her hand up.
Let's see if this will work. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, go for it.
So I asked it in the chat, sir. This is, I'm looking for, I'm trying to find where I wrote it down. But I was looking, after your study of the different theorists, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, and then looking at the space theorists that are kind of coming out of the woodwork, who would you side with? Do you have a specific theory that you're coming to mind, or are you coming up with your own?
Well, let's put it this way. I have probably 80 gigabytes of theory. You're welcome to any of it. I've got a lot of the doctrine and lists of strategies and lists of surrender criteria and so forth. I think what I haven't been able to do, though, is the modeling and simulation. Not only computer mod sim, but the desktop paper war games where you invite in people from the State Department and retired generals and all that, and see, test what their attitudes are. Because I think space is going to be a lot of that. A lot of the political and, you know, diplomatic and what the political types allow you to do. So earlier I mentioned self-deterrence. I think a lot of that's going to happen because of the political types. For years, I've worked on different, what do they call it, architecture studies for space, probably about 15 different ones. And I've always said, hey, we ought to bring in the State Department on this, because sure enough, we'll develop some sort of space weapon system. And when we really want to use it, the State Department's going to nix it. And if we bring them in early, if they said, well, why don't you just tweak it a little bit this way and that, it'd be more acceptable, or at least we'd understand it. And the attitude always was, oh, we don't want those guys in here. You know, what do they know what they're doing? They'll just say no. And, you know, it's just very insular kind of attitude. So I think that is the most significant aspect of space warfare. And, you know, to ask me, oh, should it be offense versus defense? I have to say, gee, I have to keep thinking about it. We still have to model it and so forth. I'm sorry, I have my doubts about cyber, even though that's a very in thing lately for space. And I think of it as a thought experiment. Let's say some soldiers are in the battlefield in this trench, and this egghead scientist walks up to him and says, here, look at this black box with a big red button in the center. I assure you, if you push that button, an enemy tank will stop when it's coming at you. But you can only you have to choose between that and bazooka. You only can carry one. Which one do you want? And I contend the bazooka is a lot more satisfying. When you see a smoking hole in the ground, you know you did it. If you do a cyber attack and the satellite just sits there, okay, what's the verification? Did it really work? Or did the clever adversary fake it out? He knew you were going to do that, and it still works, you know. So when you're getting really serious, I am not sure about the cyber. But I'm not a cyber expert.
It's old school. Come out with the bazooka. Okay, we will do both probably. Actually, in Scotland, especially in Scotland, I think we want to stay away from bazookas and rather solve it by cyber and by more civilized means. So
right.
We need to change a bit. And who else has a question here?
Yeah, it's hard, you know, and it depends on the what theater of operations you're in and all that.
Depends on the objective, on the circumstances entirely. You pick the weapon according to your needs and to meet your objectives. So,
in a sense, and I see that attitude too of the space type says, "Oh, we're going to take out this satellite," but that's the wrong question. The commander should say, "We want you to deny imagery of this part of the battlefield at this resolution over this time frame. We don't care how you do it, but you also have to not only take out that satellite, but you got to take out that that drone taking pictures too, because all he cares about is the effect, not taking out a satellite just because it feels good."
Yeah, there is Sean made a comment. Nearly 100% of product from space information, which is hard to separate space from cyber threats. And then we have a question. Paul, what in your perspective should be the vision of the US Space Force?
The vision. I'm sure they already printed it out, but certainly to defend our interests in space, to allow freedom of movement and action in space. And that, you know, can include a lot of things, but ultimately that's defend and attack. So you want to counter an adversary's interests. And I'm probably phrasing this wrong. We don't really care what he does in space. What we care is what those things in space are doing to soldiers on the ground. So I think, again, the Space Force misses the whole point. Since there's no colonies in space needing defending, Space Force and all of its space systems and anti-satellites and this and that all supports the ground, ultimately.
No, ultimately, yes, because this is
Yeah.
the only place
And,
where we are.
So we're not killing satellites for the fun of it. We're making sure GPS still works for that soldier on the ground. We're making sure that communication works so the commander can communicate to his troops. We're making sure we understand weather so we know when the airplanes can go left or right, kind of thing. And we want to be able to deny that capability to potential adversaries. So in a sense, that is cyber, because space is only providing information until we have weapons coming from space to Earth. You know, it's sensors, it's missile warning, it's navigation, it's communication, you know, so, and then, you know, the transmission of all that information. So really, in one sense, is information war. And people recognize that. They use the term deny, disrupt, degrade, destroy, deceive. You know, there's all these Ds. And so there's different flavors of, well, temporarily taking out a part of a satellite, permanently taking out a part of a satellite, permanently taking out the whole satellite. Because, you know, like Intelsat, maybe China is using some channels on that, and the US is too. You don't take out the whole satellite. You have to have a surgical strike and so forth. So that is all information warfare in that respect.
It would be interesting to hear Bill's perspective on that, as coming from a different, from the non-bazooka environment.
Yeah, and in terms of cyber and satellites, what I see RF and Wi-Fi as public. So a lot of the control systems that we have in industrial plants are behind the firewall and are fairly well defended. But obviously with RF, you actually have a public signal, and I don't think you can hide from that you're actually transmitting your information. And I think that communication channel is very brittle. For one thing, we're probably going to need more bandwidth if we're going to reach out to all areas of the world and to grow things like telehealth. Then we actually need to be moving up the spectrum towards the millimeter range. So I think we can't avoid that the signals are there, and it's not that difficult to be able to jam them. And obviously with GPS, it's not that difficult to be able to confuse it. If we're now running smart cars off GPS, then we could be in big trouble. So it's difficult to really differentiate the two these days, and there's almost an infinite number of ways that someone can actually try to bring down systems these days.
Mm-hmm. Ralph, thank you. Ralph Sigris says, when you can tunnel into a bank and steal 2 billion in a nanosecond, you can tunnel into a satellite or a ground link and shut things down or spin it out of control. I just need the message feed, TTPS. What about involvement in cislunar actions and movements?
So the question is, well, I don't understand. Tunneling into a bank, and now we're talking about cislunar?
Well, the question is, what about involvement in cislunar actions and movements? I believe that the bank was the comment that if we can here, if a hacker, let's say, can go to the bank in a nanosecond, then the same thing can be done to a satellite.
And yeah, certainly if you can get past the encryption, and it wasn't too long ago that a lot of those satellites weren't encrypted at all because no one really thought that was a threat. I think, again, state actors can probably do just about anything. They put their mind to it.
Yeah. Sky Jensen's setting another idea. The first space race made the Cold War total. How do you see next week's space launch from US soil influence the second space race? New space. Can we use it like we did during the Cold War to combat ideologies?
So we're talking about commercial space launches?
It is, yeah, I believe it is commercial space launches because there was information, what about defense of space commerce earlier that posted.
Yeah, I always wondered about that. And years ago, at least, I remember going to some of those space exercises, and the commercial satellite operators lived in this fantasy world thinking the Air Force was going to defend them. And I didn't even understand how they would even do that. And there might be, they invite a lot of the commercial operators now to these classified war games, and they're talking about coordination and things like that. I can certainly see them helping to defend ground sites, though even that I find hard to believe. But the actual satellite, I mean, I don't know of any defending satellite system that's up there that's, you know, floating around with another satellite, and how that would even work. And the problem is you look at the orbital dynamics, satellites pass close to each other all the time, just the normal going around, you know, and so you can't shoot down anything that looks suspicious all the time.
Yeah.
But then I also think in terms of, well, maybe space is sort of like the sea, you know, and merchant marine. I mean, we have a chief of naval operations and a chief of space operations. So the Space Force was thinking kind of naval. And they, you know, we've got these commercial ships that, you know, at one point there was pirates and things like that. And so we had the Navy helping to defend them. I guess they sort of do that in the Straits of Hormuz now and again and things like that. But that's implying space battle cruisers floating around in space.
We're talking Star Wars.
and pirates and all that. So maybe again, that's getting back to the cyber. I know years ago there was a Federal Communications Commission facility in Laurel, Maryland that would help defend against cyber attack for satellites. And they would detect what's happening, and I guess they would just try to help or something like that. I don't know if that's still around. There's probably some sort of functionality like that happening. But, you know, there was all kinds of funny things happening. I think ComSat, years ago, was jammed by a Russian trawler off the East Coast for several days, and there wasn't much they could do about it. I don't know if it was accidental or something, and a lot of this stuff is accidental.
Yeah.
So that's more frequency control and stuff like that. But I mean, if the U.S. sees some anti-satellite going towards a commercial satellite for I don't know what reason, there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah.
Unless they got some ground-based laser that's going to zap it or something, but they have nothing up there. And even if they did, space is, you know, so much bigger than the Earth.
Well, that's why it's called the final frontier.
Yeah,
And then we arrived.
about if you have this basketball, and you dribble it, and you dribble it someplace on Earth, and you tell someone, go find it on Earth. And then it's like an R² thing. It's like millions of times bigger in space. And a lot of these satellites are sizes of a basketball.
Yes.
And if you're trying really hard not to be found, no one's going to find you. And, you know, if that hidden basketball is going to kind of start bouncing against your satellite, there's probably low probability we'll see that happening before it happens. And the best we can do is forensic analysis afterwards, saying, oh, those look like dimples on your satellite. Must have been the basketball gotcha.
Yeah. We arrived at 2 hours of our lecture, and I would like to ask Bill for a little sum up, and then Paul for a little sum up, and that will conclude our event tonight. Any questions? Anyone has any more questions? Please post them to info@globalinitiatives.co.uk, and we will work as diligently as we can to provide to everyone a copy of tonight's event along with the presentations. And Bill.
Yeah, well, I think if the current situation shows anything, we really have a brittle society, and we need to be looking at alternatives to make sure that we have good internet connectivity. There are great opportunities for innovation and for enterprise. I would see the growth in this area. I know that IoT is seen as a massive growth area, but we're often thinking about a 5G integration. I think there are great market potentials for growing IoT, especially into areas such as telehealth. So I would see a vision of a growing industry, one where governments invest in the commercial opportunities, but obviously we need to defend that space too. And I think we are probably behind the curve in terms of cyber defense in the space sector. So I would hope there would be investment in that from a military point of view.
Thank you very much. Paul, what is your take on it, the final sum up?
So the time is ripe, I think, to understand and put these things on the right path, Space Force, whatever Europe is trying to figure out, before we waste billions of dollars going down the wrong way, having the wrong attitudes, the wrong thought processes, and so forth. And I think it's sort of like the 1920s and 30s, where we saw airplanes being used in World War I, but we really didn't understand how to ultimately use them. And so there was a lot of discussion and back and forth, and who was it, Billy Mitchell or something, taking out battleships with airplanes and really showing how they could be used. And it's the same with space now. We've had space for a long time in a military and civilian sense, but we didn't really understand how they should be implemented. And it's pressure from adversaries that's really changing us. So it's just the right time to get this right and set us down the right path.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everyone for attending our lecture tonight. Thank you very much for lecture. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Paul. That was great. I think this is how we will conclude. Could I just ask, please, Finn to sign out, or the guest will sign out, and just 4 of us will stay for our housekeeping and to share the presentations and everything else. Thanks, everyone, and good night. Still have some people in the room. Finn, I think we can stop recording, most certainly.